They met in their late 20s, when both were still becoming themselves. Daniel quietly ambitious, Claire brilliantly self-sufficient. And for a time, the marriage worked the way certain things work, not perfectly, but well enough that neither of them looked too closely at the seams. Claire had bought her apartment before the wedding, before Daniel, before any of this. And that fact sat in the background of their life together, the way a small stone sits in a shoe, unnoticed most days, felt only when the walking got hard. The emotional core of their marriage was built on mutual respect and a shared belief that they were, above all, reasonable people. What neither of them understood yet was that reasonable people can cause the most damage because they always have an explanation ready. The baby shower was Diane's idea. Diane Whitfield, Claire's mother, had a gift for turning other people's milestones into occasions that required her management. She had done it at Claire's college graduation, at the wedding, and now here, in the living room of the apartment on Phoenix Street, she stood near the kitchen island rearranging a platter of cucumber sandwiches that hadn't needed rearranging, explaining to Claire's Aunt Patricia that the space was just perfect once you knew how to work with it. Claire heard this from the hallway, where she was hanging up a guest's coat. She didn't react. She had long ago learned to absorb her mother's small usurpations the way you absorb weather, unpleasant, inevitable, not worth arguing with. The apartment itself was beautiful in the particular way of things that have been loved carefully over time. Claire had bought it at 26, 3 years before she met Daniel, using money she'd saved working 2 jobs through graduate school. It was a 2-bedroom on the 3rd floor of a converted brownstone in a neighborhood that had been borderline then and was genuinely nice now. She had repainted every room herself. She knew which floorboard creaked near the radiator and which window needed 2 hands to open in winter. The apartment was, in the most literal sense, hers. Daniel was in the kitchen filling a water pitcher, his movements unhurried, comfortable. He was a calm presence at parties. Not social exactly, but easy. People liked him without quite knowing why. He smiled when Claire caught his eye across the room, and it was a real smile, the kind that still meant something after 4 years of marriage. "Your mother moved the flowers again," he said quietly, handing her the pitcher. "I know. I put them back. She'll move them again." He shrugged with one shoulder, a gesture Claire had once found endearing and now found sometimes evasive. It was the gesture he made when he'd decided not to have a feeling about something. The guests arrived in clusters, college friends of Claire's, a few work colleagues, her sister-in-law Meg, Daniel's mother Ruth, who sat in the armchair nearest the window and watched everything with calm, open interest. Patricia and Diane circled each other with the careful energy of women who had known each other too long to be friends. It was, on the surface, lovely. Diane was 62 and had the posture of someone who had spent decades making sure rooms noticed her entrance. She was not a cruel woman. That was important to understand. She was not calculated in her cruelties. She was simply a woman who had spent so long believing that her love entitled her to authority that she had stopped being able to tell the difference between the two. She had raised Claire mostly alone after Claire's father left, and she had worked hard and sacrificed genuinely. And somewhere in the decades that followed, the sacrifice had calcified into a kind of ownership she'd never consciously chosen but couldn't seem to put down. Midway through the afternoon, while guests were eating and the conversation had spread into easy, overlapping noise, Diane set down her glass of sparkling water and said, clearly, to no one in particular, and therefore to everyone, "When I helped Claire get this place, I always knew it would be perfect for a family." The sentence landed quietly. A few people nodded, the way people nod at statements they haven't fully processed. Meg glanced at Claire. Ruth, in her armchair, went still in a way that wasn't quite stillness. Claire was across the room. She had heard it. She stood holding a small plate of fruit, and for a moment, just a moment, something moved across her face that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but lived in the space between them. Then she smiled at the guest beside her and continued the conversation she'd been having. Daniel had heard it too. He looked at his wife. He looked at his mother-in-law. He refilled someone's glass. The shower continued. Outside, it had begun to rain, the slow gray kind that doesn't announce itself, just arrives and stays. 3 days after the shower, Diane called to say she'd had a wonderful time. Claire was at her desk working from home, the apartment quiet around her, the particular quality of a weekday afternoon settling over everything. She put her mother on speaker and continued editing a document, while Diane described each element of the shower as though narrating a film she had directed. The flowers were gorgeous, once I got them into the right light, Diane said. Daniel actually arranged those. A brief pause. Well, they looked beautiful. Claire saved her document. Mom, what did you mean when you said you helped me get this place? The question was asked in a conversational register without sharpness, the way you might ask someone to clarify a word you hadn't quite caught. But it wasn't casual. Diane had been alive long enough to hear the difference. I just meant, you know. I was supportive when you were deciding. You were supportive. I encouraged you. I believed in you. Right. Claire clicked her pen twice, a habit she had when conceding territory she didn't intend to abandon. That's not really the same as helping me get it. Sweetheart, why are you? I'm not anything. I'm just clarifying what happened. Diane's voice shifted into its softer register, the one that meant she felt unfairly accused. I've always been proud of everything you've built, Claire. I hope you know that. They talked for 10 more minutes about nothing consequential and then said goodbye warmly enough that anyone listening would have thought the conversation had gone fine. That evening, Daniel came home to find Claire at the kitchen table with a glass of wine and a look he had learned over 4 years to read carefully. Your mom called, he said, not a question. She did. He put down his bag and stood at the counter. How was it? She said she helped me get the apartment. Daniel opened the refrigerator, looked at its contents for a moment without taking anything, closed it again. She said things like that before. I know she has. Does it? He stopped. Does it what? He chose his words with the care of someone who'd been burned before by choosing wrong ones. Does it matter at this point? People remember things differently. Claire looked at him. Not with anger. That would have been easier for both of them, with a kind of assessment, quiet and thorough, as though she were updating something she'd been tracking for a while. That's an interesting response, she said. I'm not defending her. I know you're not. I'm just saying, Daniel. Her voice was even. I know what you're saying. He sat down across from her. For a moment they were both quiet, and in that quiet lived a whole history of conversations like this one, conversations where Diane had said something and Claire had noticed, and Daniel had offered perspective, and Claire had accepted the perspective, and nothing had changed. And the next time it happened, they had the same conversation slightly differently. Daniel said, Do you want me to talk to her? No. Because I will. I know. No. He nodded. He got up and started making dinner, because that was what they did, partway through. While he was slicing onions and she had moved to the couch with the same glass of wine, Claire said almost to herself, she told Patricia and Janet and probably Meg that she helped me get this apartment, in front of my friends. He lowered the knife. Yeah, it will become true. That's how it works with her. She says something enough times and it becomes the family record. He had nothing to offer to that because it was accurate and he knew it, and what he felt about it was complex in ways he hadn't fully mapped. There was sympathy for Claire, certainly, but there was also a kind of loyalty to peace that he'd been raised with, a belief that most things could be managed if you stayed calm and didn't escalate. He wondered, not for the first time, whether that belief was wisdom or cowardice. People do that, he said eventually, rewrite things. Claire looked at him. I don't know, he said, and his voice was odd for a moment, slightly off register, as though something had briefly come loose in him. He set the knife down entirely and looked up at the ceiling, then at her, and said, I don't know. I guess, share this, if it's helpful or something. I don't know why I said that. Claire stared at him. He blinked, looked at his hands. The moment folded closed, and something that had briefly been opened shut again, with no explanation. Sorry, he said. I don't know where that came from. Okay, I just meant, he picked up the knife again. I meant your mother will keep doing this as long as it works. That's all I meant. Claire watched him for a second longer than comfortable. Then she turned back to her wine. Outside, the city made its usual sounds, indifferent and continuous. It happened 6 weeks before the baby was due. Diane had come over to help with the nursery, which meant arriving with opinions about paint colors and furniture placement, and the particular geometry of the changing table, which she felt should face the window, which Claire felt was none of her business, which she did not say. By early afternoon, Meg had arrived too, Daniel's sister, who was easy company and generally good at softening rooms. She and Diane had an odd rapport, the kind that forms between women who are both managing the same anxious energy in different registers. The 5 of them, Claire, Daniel, Diane, Meg, and Ruth, who'd come to see the nursery progress, sat in the living room after lunch with coffee and the comfortable exhaustion of people who had spent the morning doing things. It was Ruth, quietly, who accidentally opened it. She said, "It's such a lovely apartment, Diane. Did Claire tell you she was considering buying when she first started looking?" A small, innocent question. Ruth asking it because she genuinely remembered a conversation years ago where Diane had told her something about the buying process. Diane smiled. "Oh, I was very involved. We looked at 3 or 4 places together before she decided on this one. I really guided her through the whole thing. The room absorbed this." Meg looked at her coffee cup. Daniel looked at Diane. Claire was quiet for a moment that grew slightly too long. Then she said, "That's not what happened." The sentence was unremarkable in its volume. It had the flat quality of something stated, not argued. Diane's expression didn't change exactly, but it reorganized. "Sweetheart, I was there. You came to see the apartment once, after I'd already made the offer. I showed it to you. You said the ceilings were lower than you expected. I remember things differently. I know you do. Memories are, Mom." Claire set down her cup. Her hands were steady. Her voice was steady. "I bought this apartment at 26 with money I saved working at Garland and waitressing on weekends while I finished my thesis. I didn't have any help. That's not a criticism. I didn't need any, but I'd like that to be the true version." Diane's voice went soft with a kind of hurt that was real and also always strategic. "I don't understand why you're doing this in front of everyone. Because you've said it in front of everyone several times now. I've only ever, at the shower, on the phone with Patricia, when we ran into the Hendersons last month." A silence. Meg was studying a coaster with great concentration. Ruth had the careful stillness of a woman who had survived many rooms by being very quiet. Daniel said gently, "Diane." Just her name, that was all. Diane looked at him, then at Claire. Her eyes had that particular wounded brightness that meant she was deciding whether to become more hurt or less. She chose a third option, which was composed and slightly martyred. "I've only ever been proud of you," she said. "I hope that's not a crime." "It isn't," Claire said, "but it's also not the same as owning this apartment." Diane stood up and said she needed a moment in the bathroom, and that was the end of the confrontation. Not with shouting, not with tears, but with a door that closed softly down the hall. Daniel looked at Claire, looked at the empty space where Diane had been. He didn't ask if she was okay. He could see she was okay. He asked instead, "How long have you been keeping the receipts?" Meaning, how long had she been tracking this? Meaning, when did this stop being something to manage and start being something to document? Claire said, "I never threw anything away." It was a statement about the apartment. It was also something else. Daniel heard both things and stayed with them and didn't respond, because some responses require more time than a living room allows. Summer arrived, and the baby, a girl, Eleanor Ruth for Daniel's mother, a choice that had made Ruth go very quiet with something that was not quite tears, came into the apartment on Fenwick Street, and for a while everything else was reorganized around her presence. Newborns are good at this. They are relentlessly present, and their presence makes certain questions feel smaller. Diane visited twice in Eleanor's first month and behaved beautifully both times, careful with the baby, helpful in practical ways, tactful about the apartment. Claire watched this with a complicated feeling of someone who was braced for impact and been surprised by the absence of collision. She did not trust it entirely. She did not say so. Daniel noticed his wife watching. He was good at noticing, not always good at naming what he noticed. This was, if he was honest with himself, a pattern. He perceived things clearly and then set the perception down in a place where he wouldn't have to do anything about it. He had been doing this for years and had always thought of it as emotional intelligence, this calm, and was only now beginning to wonder if it was closer to avoidance. Eleanor was 6 weeks old when Meg mentioned over a casual lunch that was not supposed to be significant that Diane had told someone, a neighbor, a friend of the family, some peripheral figure whose name Meg couldn't quite recall, that she'd based Claire up in the apartment, that Diane had seen the potential in the neighborhood before anyone else had pushed Claire to take the leap. Meg delivered this the way you deliver things you know are going to cause trouble, which is to say carefully and with preemptive apology in your posture. Claire listened. She did not immediately respond. She thought about the version of her mother that was capable of the last 2 months, attentive, loving, genuinely good with the baby, and she thought about the version that kept constructing this alternate history. And she tried to understand how both could live in the same person, and she could understand it intellectually. Her mother had raised her mostly alone and had poured herself into that raising and had needed, for her own sense of self, for some of that effort to have made her essential to Claire's adult life too. The need was human, the manifestation was a lie, repeated until it became comfortable, repeated until Diane perhaps no longer fully knew she was lying. Understanding something doesn't make it tolerable. She went home and found, in the document folder she kept in the filing cabinet in the second bedroom, the title deed, the original purchase documents, the bank records showing the wire transfer from her personal account, the mortgage statements in her name alone before she and Daniel had combined finances after the wedding. She laid them out on the kitchen table and looked at them for a long time. She didn't make a decision that day, but something that had been uncertain became quietly certain. Daniel came home and saw the papers on the table and read them without touching them and said, "Oh, I've been thinking," Claire said. "About what?" "About what I'm willing to spend the next 20 years doing." He sat down. Outside, Eleanor made a small sound in the other room and then stopped. "Are we talking about your mother?" "We're talking about all of it." He understood. She could see him understanding, and she could see, too, the thing he did when he understood, the slight bracing, the interior calculation. She had once found it reassuring, that quality of steadiness. Now she was less sure of what it was. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "I want to stop performing the version of my family where everything is basically fine." He didn't say anything. "That includes us," she said. He looked at her across the kitchen table, in the apartment she had bought at 26 with her own money, and the weight of what she'd said occupied the space between them like a guest neither of them had quite invited. It was a Sunday in October when Diane came for what would be the last time for a long while. Eleanor was 3 months old and had recently discovered that making sounds produced responses from the people around her, and was enthusiastically conducting this research. The apartment was full of autumn light and the smell of coffee. It should have been an easy afternoon. Diane arrived with a bag of things she'd bought for Eleanor, a soft toy, a pair of small socks, a book about animals she claimed to remember reading to Claire as a child. She was warm and easy. She held Eleanor with practiced confidence and made the sounds that women of her generation made around babies, and Eleanor considered her with the grave, searching attention of someone encountering a new feature of the world. The papers were on the kitchen table. Diane noticed them about 20 minutes in. She sat down after handing the baby back to Claire, reached for her coffee, and glanced at them without quite looking, the way you don't quite look at something that is already registered. "What are those?" she asked. Claire said, "The ownership documents for the apartment." A beat. "Oh?" "Title deed. Purchase records. Bank transfer. mortgage in my name. Claire paused. I thought it would be useful to have them somewhere visible. Deanne's expression did the thing it did, the careful reorganization, the preparation of a position. Sweetheart, Mom, just her name. Diane looked at her daughter, at the daughter who had bought this apartment alone at 26 and repainted every wall and learned which floorboard creaked and was now sitting in the good morning light with her 3-month-old, unhurried, looking back. I've never said anything to hurt you, Diane began. I know you believe that. I've only ever, Mom, still quiet. I'm not going to argue about what happened. I know what happened. You were there sometimes. You were supportive in your way. I was grateful for your support, but you didn't buy this apartment, and you didn't help me buy it, and every time that story spreads to someone new, I have to decide whether to correct it or let it stand. And I've been letting it stand for a long time because it was easier. She looked at the papers on the table. I don't want to do that anymore. Diane was quiet in a way that was different from her usual silence. The martyrdom had gone out of it. What was left was older, less managed. I think I just wanted to feel like I was part of it, she said. Her voice was different, smaller, stripped of its usual performance. You did everything so well, so early, so independently. Sometimes it felt like there was no room. Silence. I know, Claire said. And she did know. That was the thing she'd spent months coming to. That understanding didn't change the necessary distance, but it changed how you held it. I know you wanted to feel part of it. I understand why, but the way you've tried to be part of it has taken something from me every time that I didn't consent to give. Daniel was in the other room. He could hear every word. He stayed where he was, and in that staying was a complicated truth about the last few years, that he'd known this was coming and had not quite found the courage to stand in the room where it happened. He'd been doing a lot of thinking about that. Diane left an hour later. The goodbye at the door was not cold. There was a hug, a long one, genuine on both sides. Diane cried a little. Claire held her and didn't, and that was its own kind of grief. I love you, Diane said. I love you too, Claire said. But we're going to need some time. Time from what? They both understood without having to name it. After she left, Diane stood in the elevator and then in the lobby and then on the sidewalk outside, in the October air. And she thought about the look on Claire's face. Not angry, not wounded, but settled, like a house after a storm has passed through it. She thought about whether she had known all along that she was doing this. She thought she probably had and probably hadn't, in that way where both things are true simultaneously and neither is comfortable. In the apartment on Fenwick Street, Claire was at the kitchen table, Eleanor in her arms, papers still spread in front of her. Daniel came in from the other room and stood in the doorway. She looked at him. He said, "Are you okay?" "Yes." She thought about it. "It's strange. I thought I'd feel more." "What do you feel?" She looked down at Eleanor, who had fallen asleep with the absolute confidence of someone who has never yet had to decide what to do with the people who love her badly. "Like I've been holding my breath for a really long time," Claire said. "And she exhaled. "That's it. That's all." He crossed the room and sat down beside her. He put his hand on the table near hers, not touching, just near. And she looked at his hand, and she thought about everything she'd said 3 months ago. That includes us. And she thought about whether they had done anything with that, the two of them. About whether the distance had been spoken into enough light to work with. Or whether it was still living in the way Daniel lived with things, perceived and set down. She didn't know yet. She thought they might find out. Outside, the leaves on the street were doing the October thing, golden and loose, coming down in the kind of wind that isn't cold yet, but carries the memory of cold inside it. The city made its usual sounds. Eleanor breathed against her mother's shoulder. The apartment on Fenwick Street, which Claire had bought alone at 26 with money she'd saved in graduate school, held all of it, the light, the papers, the two of them sitting in the knowledge of what was still unresolved, and the particular quiet of a life that had just, at some cost, been truthfully named.